Okay. This is funny for me because I would disagree with that statement. I would disagree with that statement, and I'm a climate scientist. What? So, this piece is a little older. It came out back on the week of the 30th, and I was actually sick that week and couldn't talk. So, I'm coming to it now, and I thought it was still interesting to talk about because a lot of my concerns has been the development and growth of a monoculture in STEM, in part because we stopped teaching that having diversity is a good thing. Having diversity of thought is a good thing and what have you. So I figured this article from Quillette, when I saw it and I read it a couple of weeks ago, would be interesting to come back to. It's really fascinating, I think. The idea, the social science culture doubles down. And I believe the author, if I remember correctly, is himself a psychologist. Excuse me. But he reveals a lot of interesting things, for at least from what I skimmed over. I skimmed it. I have not read this fully. Pardon my coughing. But I thought it would certainly be interesting to look through. So I figured we should do that with this particular article and talk about that. But of course, before I entirely forget, don't forget to come on over and support SciWorthy.locals.com. Jump over there. You can join for free and be a member and just lurk. Just be around there looking at things. But as a member rather, you can only really like things, and you can only see things that are for everybody. Anything that's for supporters, you can't see as a member. And as a member, you can't comment on things and you can't share posts yourself. So if you become a supporter of SciWorthy on locals, SciWorthy on locals at SciWorthy.locals.com, I will eventually get this pitch right. And then you can comment, you can share stuff yourself. You get access to the special show that Gina and I do behind the paywall that is SciWorthy Conversations, where we just have a fun hour-long chat on any sort of weird thing that's going on in science that we find interesting, and often go off on how stupid some of science journalism is, alongside of a few other things, and get into some deep discussions in which we invite you to comment. So you can become a supporter for as little as $3 a month, or you can give a one-time gift here. But I suggest becoming a supporter. It's a really great way to engage with the community and help the community grow. You're also supporting nonpartisan science journalism, so actually you can count, I think. No, I'm not going to say that. I got to check that before I make that statement. But if you become a supporter of SciWorthy.locals.com, you're supporting nonpartisan science journalism that's doing a lot better job, in my view, than Science or Nature or Scientific American right now. So I would suggest going on over and supporting them, and providing some nice support to them, and then you get to interact with myself and other scientists, and other science enthusiasts that are there and want to talk over all the issues going on in science, things like that. I post my videos over there regularly from this channel, so you get access to them ad-free over there, and all those kinds of good jazz. So you can get over there and give them your support. I actually don't get any money off it. I'm a supporter myself. I'm just plugging them, and I'm plugging them because they are fantastic. Anyway, back to the show. So this is written by Keith Stanovich, from August 30th, 2021. Over the past 18 months, a number of significant events have occurred that were interpreted through two entirely different worldviews. COVID-19 lockdowns, rise of the BLM movement, the riots and violence in major cities, the U.S. election process and its aftermath, and vaccine safety. YouTube, for the record, I am making no comment on COVID-19 vaccines with this video. Thank you. Many influential commentators believe that these divergent perspectives arise from an epistemic collapse, that we have ceased to value facts, science, and truth, partly because trust in the institutions that adjudicate knowledge claims, universities, media, science, and government, has eroded. Many researchers in my own discipline, psychology, have rushed to the front lines hoping to provide a remedy. But is that even plausible that we could help? Psychology and most social science disciplines are currently contributing more to the problem than to the solution. While psychology has studied phenomena such as my-side bias that drive these worrisome epistemic trends, when it attempts to tackle social issues itself, psychology is fraught with bias. it is doubtful that social scientists can help adjudicate polarized social disagreements while their own disciplines and institutions are ideological monocultures. Liberals outnumber conservatives in universities by a factor of almost 10 to 1 in liberal arts departments and education schools, and by almost 5 to 1 margins even in STEM disciplines. I will say for geosciences, left to right, liberals to conservatives in geosciences is 27 to 1 by the last number I found, which I think was 2019. I gotta check again. So somebody can fact check me on that if you can find it. I'd appreciate it, actually, because I'm not 100% sure of that number. But yeah, so what we're getting into with this is the thing about it is the ideological groupthink that seems to have come up, particularly in social sciences. And I think if you head over to Carlin Borisenko's channel, she's talked about this a fair bit and how psychology, her own field, has gone remarkably woke. So I give you a plug to go over there. But she's talked about this quite a few times. I agree that psychology seems to have gone off the deep end, and she would know it even better than I would, as much as this author probably knows it very well too. Let's see. Tests are harder when your enemies construct them. Cognitive elites like to insist that only they can be trusted to define good thinking. Ooh. That's an interesting thing when you're thinking about it. Are the elites the only ones who can define good thinking? Stop and think about that. For instance, on questionnaires sometimes referred to as science trust or, quote, faith in science scales, I hate those. I hate that phrase passionately. Respondents are asked whether they trust universities or the media or the results of scientific research on pressing social issues. I'm guilty of authoring one of these scales myself. But if they answer that they do not trust university research, they are marked down on the assessment of their epistemic ability and are categorized as science deniers. What he's saying with this is that if they're saying they don't trust, it means they're marked down as being scientifically illiterate and being anti-science by the coding that goes in the back end. Because what you have with a lot of these surveys is you have that kind of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 scale, typically referred to as a Likert scale. And you're asked, rate your level of trust in something from 1 to X, or from 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 or 1 to 11. Or, there's an I don't know button because you may not have interacted with something. There's those kinds of things. But behind the scenes, in order to be able to do the analysis with that kind of data, when you're given that, you have to code those responses. Sometimes people just leave them as 1 to 5, and other times they'll recode them to be like from -2 to 2 or something like that if it was a 1 to 5 scale originally. Things like that go on. And so you can have some of those interesting things depending on how you're looking at it. So I can understand what he's trying to say. Not to say that all scientists do that, and I'm certain there are a lot of scientists who don't or don't intend to. But there is that kind of thing there. Imagine that you are forced to take a series of tests on your values, morals, and beliefs. Imagine then that you are deemed to have failed the tests. When you protest that people like you had no role in constructing the tests, you are told that there will be another test in which you are asked to indicate whether or not you trust the test makers. When you answer that of course you don't trust them, you are told you have failed again because trusting the test makers is part of the test. That's how about half the population feels right now. So yeah, if the people making the test don't have anyone who shares your own viewpoint, then it's easy to construct a test that breaks your own values there. In short, cognitive elites load the tests with things they know and that privilege their own views. Then when people just like themselves do well on the test, they think it validates their own opinions and attitudes. Interestingly, the problem I am describing here is not applicable to intelligence tests, which, contrary to popular belief, are among the most unbiased of psychological tests. I believe he's referring to IQ tests. I'm not 100% sure on that one, but I believe he is referring to IQ tests. Their overwhelmingly left liberal professoriate has been looking for psychological defects in their political opponents for some time, but the intensity of these efforts has increased markedly in the last 2 decades. The literature is now replete with correlations linking conservatism with intolerance, prejudice, low intelligence, closed-minded thinking styles, and just about any other undesirable cognitive and personality characteristic. But most of these relationships were attenuated or disappeared entirely when the ideological assumptions behind the research were examined more closely. And he's actually got a link right here to a peer-reviewed study about that. And this is why having viewpoint diversity in sciences, social sciences, and STEM fields, I think is remarkably important, because then you can challenge those kinds of assumptions, and can you prove those assumptions are valid? But if everybody thinks the same way, then everybody can operate under the same assumption. I think it was Dwight Eisenhower who said, if everybody's thinking the same, nobody's thinking. And that is exactly the good point there. If everybody is thinking the same, nobody is thinking about some of the assumptions that could be made that are utterly faulty. And it can lead to bad conclusions, which we're about to get into, I think. The misleading conclusions drawn from these studies result in various flawed research methods. One of these is the high-low fallacy. Researchers split a sample in half and describe one group as high in a trait like prejudice, even though their scores on the scale indicate very little antipathy. When the group labeled high also scores significantly higher on an index of ideological conservatism, the investigators then announced a conclusion primed for media consumption: racism is associated with conservatism. And this is misleading conclusions, various flawed methods, split the sample in half and describe one group as high in prejudice. These kinds of things are problems, and this is why you have to have organized skepticism. This is why you have to have disinterestedness as the primary norms of science, because otherwise you get into these ideologically driven, very misleading conclusions like this. 3 types of scales, variously called racial resentment, symbolic racism, and modern racism scales, have been particularly prominent in attempts to link racism with conservative opinions. Many of these racism questionnaires simply build in correlations between prejudice and conservative views. Early versions of these scales included items on policy issues such as affirmative action, crime prevention, busing to achieve school integration, or attitudes toward welfare reform, and then scored any deviation from liberal orthodoxy as a racist response. Even endorsing the belief that hard work leads to success will result in a higher score on a racial resentment scale. Okay, in fairness and discussion with this, I would actually love to see and maybe he's got a link somewhere else. I would very much love to see a study that shows this. See more analysis and evidence that shows the flaws of this. To be perfectly honest, I would very much like to see that in here. I'm not seeing it, so I'm being fair and concerned here, even though this would be pointing out a flaw that would be in my favor as a conservative. As a political conservative myself, anyway. The social science monoculture yields this sequence repeatedly. We set out to study a trait such as prejudice, dogmatism, authoritarianism, intolerance, closed-mindedness. One end of the trait continuum is good, and the other end is bad. The scale items are constructed so that conservative social policy preferences are defined as negative. Many scientific papers are published establishing the link between conservatism and its negative psychological traits. Articles then appear in liberal publications like the New York Times, informing their readers that research psychologists, yes, scientists, have confirmed that liberals are indeed psychologically superior people. After all, they do better on all the tests that psychologists have constructed to measure whether people are open-minded, tolerant, and fair. The flaws in these scales were pointed out as long ago as the 1980s. Our failures to correct them undermines public confidence in our conclusions, as it should. After a decade or two, a few researchers finally asked if there may have been theoretical confusion in the concept. Subsequent research showed that the proposed trait was misunderstood, or that its negative aspects can be found on either side of the ideological spectrum. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, is that when there was finally somebody who pointed it out that this is a problem, it's already there in some of the literature. That's the thing about it. Even though it's not true. And anybody who's thinking, because, it's not just a psychologist, or it's not just an elite, or it's not just anybody who can... Elites are not the only one who establish good thinking. All right. If I'm operating by the principle of universalism, as I try to do, then anybody can really establish what good thinking might be. Though I do intend to, I don't know, maybe not. I have to think on that more. I don't know that. You can see as I'm reacting to this, I'm thinking through the ramifications of what I just said. So sometimes it's like, well, maybe not. I don't know. Give me your thoughts. What do you think on that one? Can anybody define what good thinking is? Maybe not. If we want to let the woke define what good thinking is, that probably wouldn't be a good thing. Anyway, continuing. For example, Conway and colleagues created an authoritarianism scale on which liberals scored higher than conservatives. They simply took old items that disadvantaged conservatives and substituted content that disadvantaged liberals. So, our country will be great if we honor the ways of our forefathers doing what authorities tell us to do and get rid of the rotten apples who are ruining everything was changed to our country will be great if we honor the ways of progressive thinking, do what the best liberal authorities tell us to do, and get rid of the religious and conservative rotten apples who are ruining everything. After the change, liberals scored higher on authoritarianism for the same reason that the old scales correlate with conservatives. The content of the questionnaire targeted their views specifically. This is the thing. That is an incredibly biased way of stating it. Biased item selection that favors our tribe. Although errors are inevitable, part of scientific inquiry, it is better that they are corrected late than never. The larger problem is that psychology's errors are always made in the same direction, just like at your local grocery, where they ring things up in overcharged direction more often than reverse. I've done it myself in the 1990s when my colleagues and I constructed a questionnaire measuring actively open-minded thinking. One of the key processing styles examined by the AOT concept is the subject's willingness to revise beliefs based on evidence. Our early scales included several items designed to tap this processing style, but my colleague Maggie Toplak and I discovered in 2018 that there is no generic belief revision tendency. Belief revision is determined by the specific belief that people are revising. As originally written, our items were biased against religious and conservative subjects. Likewise, Evan Charney has argued that some items measuring openness to experience on much-used revised NEO personality inventory require the subject to have specific liberal political affinities in order to score highly. For instance, the subject is scored as closed-minded if they respond to the item, quote, I believe that we should look to our religious authorities for decisions on moral issues, but there's no corresponding item to ask if the subject is equally reliant on secular authorities. Is it more closed-minded to rely on a theologian for moral guidance than it is to rely on a bioethicist? To a university-educated liberal cosmopolitan, the answer is clearly yes, but the answer is less obvious to those who didn't benefit from having their own tribe construct the test. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, if you're going to ask about religious, you got to ask about secular authorities too. Cherry picking to embarrass our enemies seems to be an irresistible tendency in psychology. Studies of conspiracy beliefs have been plagued by item selection bias for some years now. Some conspiracy theories are prevalent on the left, others prevalent on the right. Many have no association with ideology at all. The conspiracy belief subtest in our comprehensive assessment of rational thinking sampled 24 different conspiracy theories. It is therefore trivially easy to select conspiracy theories to produce ideological correlations in one direction or another, but those correlations will not reveal anything about the subject's underlying psychological structure. They would merely be sampling artifacts. Researcher Dan Kahan has shown that the heavy reliance on science knowledge tests on items involving belief in climate change and evolutionary origins has built correlations between liberalism and science knowledge into such measures. Importantly, his research has demonstrated that removing human-caused climate change and evolutionary origins items from science knowledge scales not only reduces the correlation between science knowledge and liberalism, but it also makes the remaining tests more valid. This is because the responses on climate and evolution items are expressive responses signaling group allegiance rather than informed scientific knowledge. And that makes me annoyed to hear that because it says to me how much my own discipline has become politicized in the public, which is annoying as all frickin' get out. I gotta be honest. But then again, regular work time, I spend a lot of time henpecking on those stupid things the left says and the stupid things the right says. But anyway, all the studies of, well, that's not entirely true. I make a point to make sure people know that some things said by politicians are stupid and incorrect, regardless of them being left or right. That's a more accurate way to say it. All of the studies of who is more knowledgeable variety in the political domain are at risk of being compromised by such item selection effects. Over the years, it has become common for Democrats to call themselves the party of science, and they are when it comes to climate science and the belief in evolutionary origins of humans. But when it comes to topics like the heritability of intelligence and sex differences, the Democrats suddenly become the party of science denial. Whoever controls the selection of items will find it difficult not to bias the selection according to their own notion of what is important. Yeah, that's a thing to watch out for, and this is the thing. This is why I hate the believe the science phrase so much, is because you're only believing it because it fits your own narrative. That's the thing. I hate it when it happens on the right. I hate it when it happens on the left. It's both of them are so wrong. It's freaking annoying. Which misinformation is important to combat and who decides? The presidential election of 2016 and the COVID-19 pandemic focused societal and research attention on the topic of misinformation. Psychological studies of the correlates of the spread of misinformation and conspiracy beliefs have poured out, but many of them have failed to take seriously the selection effects I have discussed here. Clearly, psychologists should focus on salient current events at critical times, so belief in QAnon and the election-changing voting fraud were legitimate foci of psychological attention, as was their correlation with ideology. But other historic events in 2020 and 2021 went unexamined in research on misinformation. Significant nationwide demonstrations occurred. Distorted beliefs about crime and race relations in the United States are relevant to how one understands the demonstrations and the participants in them. And this misinformation is also correlated with ideology. For example, a study conducted by the Skeptic Research Center found that over 50% of subjects who've labeled themselves as very liberal thought that 1,000 or more unarmed African American men were killed by police each year. The actual number is less than 100. Over 21% of the very liberal subjects thought that the number was 10,000 or more. The subjects identifying as very liberal also thought that 60% of the people killed by police in the United States are African American. The actual percentage is approximately 25%. In a different study, 81% of Biden voters thought young black men were more likely to be killed by the police than die in a car accident, whereas less than 20% of voters believed this misinformation. Yes, there's a lot of misinformation that was believed as a result of things going on with BLM last year, and he's pointing it out here. Misinformation cuts both ways, and right now it's being painted very significantly, I think, that only the right engages in misinformation, and that's not true. Zach Goldberg has reported a reanalysis of a Cato YouGov poll showing that over 60% of self-labeled very liberal respondents thought that the United States is more racist than other countries. Such a proposition is not strictly factual, but it does suggest a lack of context if one responds strongly agree. In fact, many propositions in so-called misinformation scales are less than factual. Both the media and polls... Well, that's fun, isn't it? Hold on. So in other words, the propositions they are testing in the studies about misinformation are themselves misinformation. That's hysterical. Okay, thank you for this psychologist pointing it out. Both the media and pollsters throughout 2020 often labeled respondents misinformed if they indicated in questionnaires that the BLM demonstrations of 2020 involved widespread violence or that they were not mostly peaceful. There is enough interpretive latitude in such terms as widespread or mostly peaceful that such phrasing should be avoided in questionnaires intended to label part of the populace as misinformed. Generally, I think a lot of this phrasing should be avoided, period, because widespread. Well, okay, what do you think is widespread? What versus what I think is widespread? So labeling that, so putting that in there and asking somebody to think if they thought protests in 2020, summer 2020 were widespread. What does widespread mean? What does mostly peaceful mean? In the case of CNN, mostly peaceful probably means there's a building burning in the background, but hey, there's that, right? And things going on there. So I tend to say we probably should avoid these things when we're doing surveys to begin with, because you're leaving so many things up to the interpretation of the individual person, when you do these kinds of surveys. And others can comment, psychologists out there, if you're watching this, please comment. Please feel free to tell me I'm wrong. I totally want to hear from you. I'm curious. Selection bias also plagues the recently popular trust in experts measures that many behavioral scientists are using. The scales ask whether the subject would be willing to accept the recommendations within their area of expertise of several groups, within their area of expertise of several groups, including scientists, government officials, journalists, lawyers, etc. The researchers clearly view low-trust subjects as epistemically defective in their failure to rely on expert opinion when forming their beliefs. The respondent, of course, cannot verify the specific expertise of an expert in these domains. And that's true because, For me, my degree is atmospheric science, but I do climate science and climate modeling a lot of the time. So there's things like that. People, when they get into their advanced degrees, get very specific in their expertise, even though the degree itself may be more general. Bear that in mind. Absent that, it is impossible to judge the optimal willingness to accept expert opinion. Yet the investigators clearly view more acceptance of information from experts as better, indeed maximum acceptance. Answering complete acceptance on the scale is implicitly deemed optimal in the statistical analysis of such measures. That's going back to the coding thing that I mentioned. How you code it on the back end really does matter a lot in how you do statistical analysis. And so that needs to be when I see it in social science, because occasionally when I do peer review, I get interdisciplinary studies that have social science stuff involved in it and psychologist stuff involved in it. So I make a point to check on those things, knowing at least enough to be dangerous here to say, how did you code it? Does it make sense how you coded it? Are you being biased in how you coded it? All those kinds of things. I try to ask those questions of myself as I'm reading it, and, just check it. Do a gut check. How times have changed. In the 1960s and 70s, it was viewed as progressive to display skepticism toward these groups of experts. Encouraging people to be more skeptical toward government officials and journalists in universities was considered progressive because it was thought that the truth was being obscured by the self-serving interests of supposed authorities listed on the current expert acceptance questionnaires. Yet when conservatives now evince skepticism on these scales, it is viewed as an epistemological defect. In other words, we don't know anything, is the idea that is communicated there. According to this gentleman, I would like, he's writing a lot from his opinion here, and it may be from his expertise. I would actually love to see more of how he thinks that. Can you point me to an example of a survey that you've done and how it was done that would lead to that kind of a bias? I would actually be very curious to see that, because I'd like to identify it myself if it comes up. So if Mr. Stanovich, I believe is your name, I lost it at the beginning, if you do end up watching this, I would love to see it if you could point to an example and show me what you mean and how that was biased. That would be great. I'd be very curious to see that, because I'm obviously not a psychologist, so I would love to see how you have figured that out, and how one could go about seeing that. Related to these trust in the expert scales, or trust in science scales, in the psychological literature, or their complement, anti-scientific attitude scales, I have constructed such a scale, but now consider it to be conceptual error and prone to misuse. Asking a subject if they believe science is the best method of acquiring knowledge is like asking them if they have been to college. At university, one learns to endorse items like this. Every person with a BA knows that is a good thing to follow the science. I hate that phrase. The same BA equips us to critique our fellow citizens who don't know that trust the science is code word used by university-educated elites. Yeah. So I have removed the anti-science attitude subtest from my lab's omnibus measure of rational thinking, the comprehensive assessment of rational thinking. I don't think it provides a clean and unbiased measure of that construct. If we want to understand people's attitudes towards scientific evidence, we have to take a domain-specific belief that a person holds on a scientific matter, present them with contrary evidence, and see how they assimilate it, as some studies have done. You can't just ask people if they follow the science on a questionnaire. It would be like constructing a test and giving half the respondents the answer sheet. Yeah. The authors of these questionnaires can be quite aggressive in demanding extreme allegiance to a particular worldview if the respondent is to avoid the label anti-science. For example, one scale requires the subjects to affirm propositions such as, we can only rationally believe in what is scientifically provable. Science tells us everything there is to know and what reality consists of. All the tasks human beings face are soluble by science. Science is the most valuable part of human culture. This is quite strict and uncompromising set of beliefs that to have to endorse to avoid ending up in the low faith in science group in an experiment, or in life generally for that matter. I guess I'd end up in the low faith in science category for the number of times I've said that science, for all its good things that it does, and the philosophy of science and the practice of it, it can't provide anyone wisdom. And this is now that I'm thinking about it, what he's describing is a good example of a lack of wisdom because of the groupthink that is going on. And probably, I probably would have to say unintentionally at this point. Because if you're just around people who all think the same, it's not like you're going to have somebody there to challenge your assumptions for you. So you're going about doing what you think is best, even though it's probably not at that point. So I'm willing to give a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. And perhaps more so than the psychologist is who's authoring this piece. Let the other half of the population in. We lament the skepticism directed at university research by about half of the U.S. public, yet we conduct our research as if the audience were only a small coterie sharing our assumptions. Consider a study that attempted to link conservative worldview with the denial of environmental realities. Subjects were presented with the following item. If things continue on their present course, we will soon experience major environmental catastrophe. If the subject did not agree with this statement, they were scored as denying environmental realities. Okay. This is funny for me because I would disagree with that statement. I would disagree with that statement, and I'm a climate scientist. What? The term denial implies that what is being denied is a descriptive fact. However, without a clear description of what soon or major or catastrophe mean, all fair points here, this is why I don't like such vague language, the statement itself is not a fact, and so labeling one set of respondents as science deniers based on an item like this reflects more than the tendency of academics to attach pejorative labels to their political enemies. The tendency to assume that a liberal response is the correct response, or ethical response, or fair response, or scientific response, or open-minded response is particularly prevalent in sub-areas of social psychology and personality psychology. It often takes the form of labeling any legitimate policy difference with liberalism as some kind of intellectual or personality defect. Dogmatism, authoritarianism, racism, prejudice, or science denial. In a typical study, the term social dominance orientation is used to describe anyone who doesn't endorse both identity politics, emphasizing groups when thinking about justice, and the new meaning of equity, equality of group outcomes. A subject who doesn't endorse the item group equality should be our ideal is scored in the direction of having a social dominance orientation, wanting to maintain the dominant group hierarchy. A conservative individual or an old-style liberal who values equality of opportunity and focuses on the individual will naturally score higher in the social dominance orientation than a left-wing advocate of group-based identity politics. A conservative subject is scored as having a social dominance orientation even though group outcomes are not salient in their own worldview. In such scales, the subject's own fairness concepts are ignored and the experimenter's framework is instead imposed upon them. I did not know that. Wow. I didn't know that about psychology studies. I would like to see, again, show me some examples of where this is true and what you're talking about. Give me a study to read, and I may go digging to go find it because I'm really curious now. But, in fact, the matter, got a link here. Good. I'm going to remember that for later. Myself, a conservative individual, but that's really interesting. You're in other words, you're constructing a survey that confirms your own worldview as being good, and when somebody else doesn't confirm that, they get scored lower. Or in this case, scored higher in social dominance orientation, which social dominance orientation would then connect with the woke nonsense of saying, everybody who doesn't agree or everybody who favors individualism, equality, and what have you is therefore in favor of maintaining the dominant culture of white supremacy. Something like that would be what the woke would say with respect to this. But instead, the problem is you're actually imposing your own worldview onto others and saying the worldview of the others is bad. Fascinating. Goodness. The study goes on to define skepticism about science with just 2 items. The first, we believe too often in science and not enough in faith and feelings, builds into the scale a direct conflict between religious faith and science that many subjects might not actually experience, thus inflating correlations with religiosity. The second is, when it comes to really important questions, scientific facts don't help very much. If a subject happens to believe that the most important things in life are marriage, family, raising children with good values, and being a good neighbor, and thus answers they agree on this item, they will score higher in the science skepticism scale than a person who believes that the most important things in life are climate change and green technology. Neither of these items shows that conservative subjects are anti-science in any way, but they ensure that conservatism religiosity will remain correlated with the misleading construct that names the scale science skepticism. It's no wonder that only Democrats strongly trust university research anymore. That's interesting right there. A whole bunch of stuff in here that I'm learning that I didn't know about. This is a bit of a long piece, so I'm going to skip through just a little bit because I know there's some other things that I wanted to talk about that I saw here. And this is a long piece from him. This video has already gotten quite long. Let's see. Doubling down the heart of our epistemic crisis. As academia's ideological bias has become more obvious and public skepticism about research has increased, academia has become more insistent that relying on university-based conclusions is the sine qua non of proper epistemic behavior. The second-order skepticism toward this demand is in turn treated as new evidence that the opponents of the left-wing university conclusions are indeed anti-intellectual know-nothings. Institutions, administrators, and faculty do not seem to be concerned about the public's plummeting trust in universities. Many people, though, see the monoculture as a problem. If academics really want to address it, they would be turning to mechanisms such as those recommended by the Adversarial Collaboration Project at the University of Pennsylvania. Adversarial collaboration seeks to broaden the frameworks within research groups by encouraging disagreeing scholars to work together. Researchers from opposing perspectives design methods that both sides agree constitute a fair test and jointly publish the results. Both sides participate in the interpretation of the findings and conclusions based upon pre-agreed criteria. Adversarial collaboration prevents researchers from designing studies more likely to support their own hypotheses from dismissing unexpected results. Most importantly, conclusions based on adversarial collaborations can be fairly presented to consumers of scientific information as true consensus conclusions and not outcomes determined by one side's success in shutting the other out. There is a major block, however. It is not certain that in the future universities will have enough conservative scholars to participate in the needed adversarial collaborations. The diversity statements the candidates for faculty positions must now write are a significant impediment to increasing intellectual diversity in academia. A candidate will not help their chances of securing a faculty position if they refuse to affirm the tenets of the woke successor ideology and also pledge allegiance to its many terms and concepts without getting too picky about their lack of operational definition. Diversity, systemic racism, white privilege, inclusion, equity, and so on. Such statements function like ideological loyalty oaths. If you don't intone the required shibboleths, you won't be hired. This is one of the reasons why I do not like DEI statements in hiring. I do believe they actually impose ideological litmus tests on people, and so, I personally will avoid applying for a job that has one of these. I will not do it. I will not apply for a job that has an ideological litmus test tucked into it. Other institutions for adjudicating knowledge claims in our society have been too cavalier in their dismissal of the need for adversarial collaboration. When fact-checking fails in the political domain, the slip-ups often seem to favor the ideological proclivities of the liberal media outlets that sponsor them. Fact-checking websites were quick to refute the Trump administration's claims that a vaccine would be available in 2020. NBC News told us that the experts say he needs a miracle to be right. Of course, we now know the vaccine rollout began in December 2020. Yeah, that's the thing is, there is, I'm not going to go through this section because I think I know what he's talking about here, is the issue with fact checkers. And I think that would be interesting, to have adversarial collaboration. But he does have a point. Right now, there's not a whole lot of conservatives, and there's not a whole lot of conservatives that are interested in going into it. When you think of things like the Center for the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology Study in March talked about 70% of conservatives say they work in a hostile work environment at a university. 60 some odd percent of conservative graduate students report being deterred from going to grad school. Those kind of things are happening. Why would we want to go? Why would anybody want to work at a university? Why would any conservative want to get a university degree if we feel like it's just a place to have an ideological litmus test or have an ideology shoved down our throat? And I've had students talk to me about how they feel about this and that they feel like they're being suffocated. Which, if you're out there, you're not alone on that. You are not alone. Let's see. Let me get to the ending here. I won't chronicle all the failures. It is worth noting, though, that increased interaction between epistemologically failing institutions has helped to create a closed-loop heterodox academy blog. Yep. Okay. Our society-wide epistemic crisis demands institutional reform. Academics continue to pile up studies of the psychological deficiencies of voters who don't pull the Democratic lever or who voted for Brexit. They amass conclusions on all the pressing issues of the day. Immigration, crime, inequality, race relations, using research teams without any representation outside of the left liberal progressive consensus. We, universities, social science departments, my tribe, have sorted by temperament, values, and culture into a monolithic intellectual edifice. We create tests to reward and celebrate the intellectual characteristics with which we define ourselves and to skewer those that we deploy. We have been cleansing disciplines of ideologically dissident voices for 30 years now with relentless efficiency. The population with a broader range of psychological characteristics no longer trusts us. The transparency reforms in the open science movement are effective mechanisms for addressing the replication crisis in social science, but they will not fix the crisis of trust discussed here. It's not just the transparency that our field needs. It's tolerance of other viewpoints. We need to let the other half of the population in. In a small paperback book for psychology undergraduates that I first published in 1986, it's almost as old as I am. Or it is as old as I am, rather. I told the students that they could trust the scientific progress in psychology, not because individual investigators were invariably objective, but because any biases a particular investigator might have would be checked by many other psychologists who held different viewpoints. When I was writing the first edition in 1984 to 1985, psychology had not yet become the handmaiden of a partisan media in a closed monocultural loop. The book has gone through 11 editions now, and I no longer can offer my students that assurance. On most socially charged public policy issues, psychology no longer has the diversity to ensure that the cross-checking procedure can operate. Obviously, greater intellectual diversity among researchers would be a key corrective, but adversarial collaboration is also critical. You can't study contentious topics properly with a lab full of people who think alike. If you try to do so, you will end up creating scale items that produce correlations that are inaccurate by a factor of 2, like I once did. Alas, the field whose job it is to study my side bias won't take steps to control for this epistemic flaw in its own work. Very nice. Very nice. And, I don't think it's just psychology that's starting to suffer from this problem. And I honestly wish it wasn't the case that I didn't have to say this, that I think some of STEM is certainly starting to suffer from this problem of groupthink and being ideologically favoritism toward one particular thing or another. And particularly when I see it from things like American Geophysical Union and American Meteorological Society and a few other places where these are STEM disciplines, or like the American Mathematical Society where the vice president was attacked for saying she doesn't think DEI statements are a good idea, which you can find in another video I've done on this channel. I talked about that briefly. Yeah, and I don't think it's just that. And there's a heck of a lot of transparency that needs to be done. There's a heck of a lot of consideration for viewpoint diversity that needs to happen. And like I said, even my own field in STEM, it's very rare to run across a conservative in STEM at this point. And so, yeah, I agree with this guy, and I'm going to keep harping on it. And, if you're out there and you happen to be conservative and you're in college right now and you really want to go into the sciences, please, please, please don't give up on it, because I swear there's a lot of good conservatives out there that we may be few and far between, but we are good people and we'll give you that support. And we need the adversarial collaboration that he has talked about here, and that cannot happen if one side, if people of different viewpoints from the current climate in academia don't try to get there. So I hope we can get there someday. So that's it for me. If you like this video, please hit the like button on your way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. I would also say, head on over, as I said before, to SciWorthy.locals.com and become a supporter there. And you can also then there connect with me and others. So with that said, I'm Adrian signing off. I hope you stay curious.